What can you learn from a bad movie sequel that will help you become a successful writer? What happens in them that makes them so bad? And what can you learn from them, and what not to put in your novel and what to put in your novel to make them as great as you can be? We're going to be addressing those questions and more, and we're starting right now. What is the biggest problem with movie sequels that you can learn from to make your books better? The biggest problem with a sequel is that they don't challenge the protagonist in any way. A successful story is a journey. The protagonist is on a journey in which they have to learn about themselves in order to become a better person, in order to solve the problem at the climax of the story, so they can go back to living their regular life as a better person. And we see this in a lot of in a movie that comes out, in which a character has their life disrupted. They are now put out onto a journey in which they have to face trials along the way. And then when they solve those trials, they can deal with the antagonist at the end and solve the problem and go back to living a regular life. And as someone who is reading a book or watching a movie, you see the journey, you see their struggle. It's an emotional one, it's a difficult one. Just like when writing any story, the protagonist should not have it safe. There should be a massive struggle, big hills that they have to overcome. Like they say, you have to get your protagonist in the mud and get them dirty and have them face the biggest struggles of their life in order to overcome the problem. The bigger the struggles, the more successful the story. The more emotional, the more successful the story. But we have a problem though. When it comes to movie sequels, we find that this does not happen. The protagonist has found their answer in the first movie. They have become at peace with themselves in the first one. So in the second one, there's no real reason for the movie to be made. What ends up happening is that the movie ends up being all about the villain. The villain becomes the star, and the protagonist actually ends up standing around not doing anything. They are the least active character in the movie. If you ever watch a sequel, you will see that the protagonist isn't challenged. They're not on any emotional journey. They don't have anything to learn. They just have to deal with this bad villain who has come along. And the protagonist more or less just stands around, not doing anything, not learning anything. And a story's success is about the protagonist's journey, what they learn, what we can learn from what they learn. It's almost as if when you watch a movie, you are the protagonist. You put yourself into the movie. So when they have to struggle and learn, you feel like you are learning, you are struggling. But when you watch the sequel, the protagonist just more or less stands around and doesn't do anything. So why would you care about watching a sequel where the protagonist isn't on a journey? A villain is very important to sell a story. However, the villain is not what draws us into the story. We're drawn in by the protagonist's journey. And in a sequel, the focus is on the villain. A lot of times, movie writers think if you make the villain bigger and badder than the first, then it's going to be as successful. The fact is, this does not happen. The villain becomes the focal point, in which the villain just wants to rule the world or destroy everything. Their goals are meaningless. Whereas in the original, the villain actually had a legitimate reason for what they were doing. You may not agree with them, but at least they had a reason why they were doing what they were doing. Whereas in the sequel, the villain is bad just for being bad. And they look evil. They have mean looking eyes. They wear all black. And these are just stereotypes of bad villains. Whereas in the original, the villain had a personality. They had reasons for what they were doing. And in the sequel, the villain is just bad for the sake of it. And the story feels empty because the protagonist doesn't do anything and the villain is just acting evil for the sake of acting evil. Whereas in the original, the two characters, chances are they interact with each other throughout the story. They are a mirror image of each other. It's almost like they're the same person. One is good, one is bad. But who will win in the end? Whereas in the sequel, the villain and the protagonist have nothing in common. They're not the same person. The protagonist is happy with their life. They've solved the problems in the first movie. And the villain is bad just for the sake of being bad. And it makes for a boring, weak story. Another problem with making a sequel is the writer didn't have any plans for a sequel. They wrote the script for the first one to have a beginning, middle, and end, and a conclusion in which you walk away from. And then when the movie is successful, all of a sudden they want to come up with a sequel. And they write it really quickly. If you ever look at some of the most successful movies ever made, they were based off of novels in which the writer took a long time to write, 2 or 3 years or more, in which the novel is released, it does well, it gets made into a movie, but then the sequel comes along and they write it in just a couple of weeks, maybe a month. There's a lot of sequels out there in which the script is being written while they are filming. They literally do not have a script ready for Tuesday when they're shooting on a Monday. That makes it really difficult to tell a good story. Imagine it as a writer. If you were writing something and within 5 seconds of finishing the first draft, you sent it to a literary agent, how successful would that be? Ask any writer and they will tell you that they had to rewrite their successful novel 4 or 5 times before they sent it to an agent. But if you write something and send it to an agent right away and have it published, chances are that's going to be a weak novel. But we see this happening in Hollywood, where they will write a script while they are shooting the movie. Can you imagine writing something at noon and having it published in the evening? That's not how you write a novel. But we see this in Hollywood with sequels. When writing a novel, you always have to remember there has to be an emotional connection between the reader and the protagonist. They have to be at one. And when you write a novel in which the reader feels an emotional connection, that is what motivates them to turn the page. Because that's what writing is. It's all about getting the reader to want to turn the page, to find out what's going to happen next. How is the protagonist going to survive this problem? When you write a sequel in which the protagonist is not threatened, is not in danger, then no one's going to have any motivation to turn the page because the protagonist is fine. They're in fact standing around bored while this evil villain wants to take over the world, in which the protagonist finally interacts with them at the end. A lot of successful novels will have the two characters interacting with each other throughout the novel. And in a sequel, a lot of times the good guy and bad guy only meet with one another at the very end. This does not sound compelling. This does not give somebody watching the movie motivation to care about watching. And this is what you can learn as a writer. You have to make sure your protagonist and antagonist are constantly interacting with each other throughout the novel. You want to give your villain a reason why they are doing what they do. Are they being bad just for the sake of it, as they are in movie sequels? Or do they believe that they have a reason for what they're doing, even if it is bad? And you can put this in with your antagonist. Give them a reason. When you're writing and you finish your novel, ask yourself, if I'm going to write a sequel, maybe a sequel to the novel you finished, you may or may not, but have an idea. When you look at Tolkien, when he wrote Lord of the Rings, he had the idea of 3 novels in mind. He knew he wasn't going to write a conclusion at the end of the first, only to have it successful and then make up a second and a third one. He came up with the idea of 3 novels, breaking up the story into 3 separate novels with the conclusion at the end. Can you imagine if Lord of the Rings had a full conclusion at the end of the first, and then it became a successful novel, and then Tolkien decided to make a second, and then after that was successful, he made a third. The problem is that there is no character or story arc throughout all three novels, because when you write a sequel, you want it to be a carryover from the original. But if your character arc finishes at the end of the first, well, the sequel is going to be weak. It's going to be awkward, because now you're resurrecting these characters to come back in which they have no trials to go through, nothing to challenge them. All you end up doing is creating this evil villain who wants to take over the world just for the sake of it. And it feels empty. Successful novels feel full. A weak novel feels empty. Movie sequels feel empty. As a writer, you don't want to be writing any empty stories. You want to give your villain a motivation, a justified reason in their mind why they're doing. The protagonist has to be on a journey on how they have to look within inside themselves to become a better person and face their trials. So when they face the villain at the end, they can finally defeat them and carry on with their life. Does this mean that you cannot write a sequel to your novel? Of course you can. There's nothing wrong with writing a sequel, but you want to make sure you do it right. And you do it right by making sure that the focus of the novel itself is the emotional journey of the protagonist and how they have to face many difficult trials along the way. Don't make the villain the selling point. We like reading about the villain, but that's not why we buy the book. A great movie sequel was Spider-Man Part 2, where we see the protagonist, Peter Parker, facing many struggles, looking after his aunt, having a job, doing well in school, stopping bad villains. In fact, a lot of people say that the sequel is better than the original. And one of the big reasons is the protagonist's character faces more difficulties physically and emotionally in the second than he did in the first. If the sequel had the character living a nice, normal, comfortable life where there were no struggles, no emotional journeys, and the focal point was just the villain, then that would make the story weak. However, in the sequel, we see the protagonist on a massive journey emotionally and physically. So that way, we connect with him, we feel, and we worry, how is he going to overcome these obstacles? So yes, it is possible for you to write a sequel to your novel, but remember, you have to put your character through difficult times, make things difficult. Give your character an arc in the second like you did the first. And don't make the selling point the villain only. Make the journey of the protagonist the biggest selling point to your novel. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to check out my website, where I have a ton of blogs that can help you become the greatest writer you can be. I'm going to leave a link in the description below, where you can visit my website right now and become the greatest writer you can be. Do you want to learn how to place a flashback into your novel and do it properly? Well, be sure to check out my other video. In fact, I'm going to leave a link for it right here that you can click on it right now. And you can learn how to put a flashback into your novel and do it right, and what not to do.